Let's move on to our first speaker. It's my honor to introduce Peter. I am not good at reading bios, and since Google's out there, you can find out about anybody very quickly. So I would encourage you to Google Peter. What I'm going to do for each one of the speakers is tell you 3 things you might not know about the person and 1 thing you probably don't know about the person. Before I tell you that, I will say this. Legacy's funny. You know, a good metaphor for legacy is dropping a pebble in a pool. And if you live long enough, that little ripple will go to the other end of the pool and come back and hit you. And each one, so we all, every day, we're all dropping pebbles in the pool and making a difference in people's lives. But you know, you often don't get a chance to hear that. So I will tell you that at this conference, we broke into a completely new industry, which is great. We've learned incredible amounts, and I've made lots of friends. I will also tell you that I made one of my better friends and have a business partner that I met here at this conference. So Peter has had a huge impact on my life, and it's an honor to get a chance to introduce him. Okay, so a few things you might know about Peter. He helped found this conference and has been the chair of this conference since it started. So he's the man behind the curtain pulling the levers. He's a full-time academic, and he's tenured, so he can no longer be fired, which is awesome, so he can say what he thinks. His hobby is actually teaching. He's taught his whole life, and that's his hobby. And here's one that you probably don't know. He loves fast cars. Ask him the kind of car he drives, and ask him why he's pulled over at least 2 or 3 times a year, and why he never gets a ticket. Please welcome Peter Koen.
Thank you, Mike. Hopefully you won't tell that to the next policeman I see. So a question that I want to start out with is, are you wasting your time at this conference? And let me kind of take you back to the beginning of the conference, which was in 2003. Let me do, and here's actually the first brochure, let me do a little nostalgia with you. So do you remember the Grammy Award winner in 2003? Nora Jones?
Come away with
me. All right. How about the Oscar Award, the movie that won the Oscar? Chicago. In addition, let's take a look at some of the products and services you were using at that time. So most of you had a BlackBerry or a Palm. We got our videos in Blockbuster. In fact, Blockbuster had the most stores at that time. We were also shooting pictures with film. All of these companies essentially have went out of business since 2003. The question is, have we learned anything since 2003? And would you make those same mistakes today? So let's take a look at some data. Let's take a look at the lifespan of companies back in 1960. It was 60 years. If we take a look at 2003, it's 22 years. And in fact, if we project for this year, it's 18 years. So we've actually gotten worse and not better. But the interesting thing is that we essentially know today what the problem is. And the problem is being able to balance both sustaining and transformational and disruptive innovation. I could fill this particular overhead with lots of studies, but let me provide you with some definitions, and let's take a deeper dive into this particular topic. So first, what do I mean by sustaining and transformational innovation? I absolutely hate the term of breakthrough innovation because it's not terribly precise. So let's take a look at what a sustaining innovation is. So here's an example from Procter & Gamble. A sustaining innovation is that they make toothpaste and they change the flavoring of toothpaste. A whole bunch of new SKUs, and sustaining innovations are responsible for 90-95% of the innovations in your company. Let's take the next step up, and that's transformational innovation. Now, transformational innovations are adjacencies. And again, I'm not using the term breakthrough because I believe it's imprecise. I believe transformational innovations are the area that large enterprises can make tons of money in. Let's take a look at a couple of transformational innovations. The first is the iPod or the iTunes. Think about Apple at the time that they invented the iPod. It's no new technology, but they're using the technology in completely different ways, and they're entering the music area, and they were a PC company. So it's really a transformational innovation for them. It takes them into a completely new market. It's not a sustaining innovation. At the bottom is another example of a transformational innovation from Procter & Gamble. This is white strips. So prior to Procter & Gamble coming out with white strips, you would go for whitening to the dentist. So here they're putting a product in the supermarket, which is one of their competencies, one of their channel competencies, and it's a transformational innovation for them. For those of you, of course, are in large industries, in large enterprises, this is not easy to do, to open up a transformational innovation. But it's not that huge step to what I would call disruptive innovations. So these are transformational innovations. If I then go to disruptive innovations, I have two. One, I don't know, I'll give you a minute to recognize. This is actually one of the first digital cameras. Anyone guess who invented it? So that's Kodak. So it's actually, it's the first digital camera invented by Kodak. And in the far right, I have Virgin's Galactica, which is going to fly on the edges of the Earth. So these are really disruptive innovations, an even further step. So the problem and how you don't go out of business is being able to balance sustaining and transformational innovation. And in 2003, we didn't know how to do that. In 2017, I believe we do know how to do that. However, one of my frustrations, in a way that some companies do and some companies don't, I'm fortunate that I have a number of companies who support my research at Stevens, some of the leading innovation companies in the world. I think many of our are in the top 50 innovation companies in the world. They know how to do that. What's frustrating to me is I teach at Stevens, I teach an innovation course every year to MBAs. Now, last year I taught it to MBAs from this group of companies. They don't have a clue of the methods that you need to balance sustaining and transformational innovation in large companies. And that frustrates me. Now the question is, do you know how to balance transformational and disruptive innovation? Now, since I'm an academic, I'm allowed to give you a pop quiz. So I'm going to give you 6 questions, and I'll challenge you if you can get all 6 correct. All right? If you get all 6 correct, then you know how to do this balance. All right? So, first question. How should you make innovation management decisions at your company? I have 5 choices. 1, what others seem to be doing. 2, what senior leaders have done in the past. 3, closely held ideologies. 4, learning practices at high-performing companies. Or none of the above. So again, take out your notepads or whatever. This is a real quiz. All right? We'll collect your responses at the end. All right? And you can't go to any part. No. Okay. So I'll give you a few seconds to come up with the answer. All right? Everybody got the answer? First question? Okay? The right answer is none of the above. Decisions in our decisions should be based on evidence-based approaches. What do I mean by evidence-based approaches? So here's a paradox. Many of you spend tons of money on consultants and training. Lots of books on management. Last night I Googled innovation tools. There are 420 million of them. I also Googled organizing around breakthrough innovation, and there are 683,000 hits. However, how come all of that doesn't produce any lasting results? And I think the reason is that we often make our decisions not on evidence. We make them on what we think is right. Now, what do I mean by evidence? So I'm hoping most of you are familiar with the great series of books from Jim Collins. He did evidence-based research. So here's an example from his first book. He looked at visionary companies, and had a control group of comparison companies. So you're just not looking at best in class, you're comparing very good with not so good and really looking at the difference. That's evidence. You also have, for example, these are Clay Christensen's book. Clay is phenomenal in doing evidence-based research. Lots of examples from companies and doing comparisons between controls and companies that really succeed. So again, that's evidence. Now, on the other hand, you have what I would call anecdotal. This is a great book. This is a great book on Steve Jobs, but it's anecdotal, it's not evidence. And I think one has to make this important distinction. I like to use the analogy, it's like playing blackjack or roulette. In blackjack, you can by counting cards, you can actually create a winning strategy. When you play roulette, that you can win some of the times, and that's really anecdotal information. So again, you want to be focused on evidence-based management, evidence-based methodologies. So let's take a look at question 2. What do you think is the most critical factor in maintaining this balance? 1, senior leadership. 2, having dedicated resources. 3, having a risk-accepting culture. A dedicated full-time team, or understanding the change process. Again, for those of you who are keeping track, I'll give you another maybe 5 seconds to come up with an answer. Everyone got it? Okay, the answer is leadership. Whoops, I went too quick. Okay, the answer is senior leadership. Let me give you one example. So here we see an example from Apple. Steve Jobs came to Apple in 1997 and did not change any of the people. But he changed the strategies, he decreased the number of products, and focused on the competencies of design and user-friendly software. So again, and there are lots of examples, but if senior leadership doesn't get the importance of the balance, then it'll never work. Let's go to the next question. What's the most successful organizational structure for maintaining this balance? So there are 3 different structures. I'm going to just tell you what the different structures are, and then let you do the third question. The first structure in organizations for doing transformational innovation is I maintain the sustaining business and have some people from manufacturing, sales, and R&D work on it. The second one is the so-called skunk works, where we have a completely separated business. They're off doing their own thing. The third is what I call ambidexterity, where you have the transformational business within the existing business, but separated with some links to the existing business. All right? So, three possible structures: integrated, separated, or ambidextrous. What do you think? Again, I'll give you a few seconds to come up with the right answer. The right answer is ambidextrous. Lots of studies that have shown an ambidextrous organization is the ideal structure for maintaining the balance. Studies by Mike Tushman and Charles O'Reilly show that they're 90% more effective in developing transformational innovations. Again, another study showing that when you compare integrated and separated, the ambidextrous have success. So a question that I'm always asked is, gee whiz, why doesn't skunkworks work? I mean, it just seems it has some great anecdotal stories, but why doesn't it work? For those of you who have been involved in skunkworks, and I have, what you typically get is an absolutely great team working on a great project, but it often completely misses the mark. They do things completely off on their own, and then they come back, so it absolutely misses the mark. Then they come back to the organization and say, okay, we developed this great thing, please integrate it with the current sustaining businesses, and they get a no. It just doesn't fit in. So again, evidence-based management shows that it's the ambidextrous organization which in fact really is the best one to use for managing this balance. Question 4. What is the best way to get customer input? 3 ways: market analysis, 2, preference testing, or deep dives. So I don't know if anybody is so far 100%, but we'll see in a few minutes. All right, so answer to this question. So this question is, it's deep dives. Let me give you another example. Excuse me, I got ahead of myself. So asking your customer doesn't work. I love this quote from Henry Ford. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Also look for, when you do these deep dives, you look for something what I call compensatory behavior. Let me give you an example from Procter & Gamble. So Procter & Gamble continues to want to improve on their Tide product. So they went into people's houses and they observed women who tend to do the washing and cleaning in the house, and asked them what they wanted in a better product. And they didn't come up with any great suggestions, but simply watched carefully at what the users of Tide were doing. And they found that there was this crust of soap that existed on the Tide container, and the compensatory action is that the parent would wipe it off continually. And they saw this again and again in houses. And that led them to the insight of getting rid of the liquid and coming up with the Tide Pod. So again, it's that deep dive and compensatory action which enabled them to come up with a truly great product. And Tide is one of P&G's biggest innovations in many decades. Okay. Let's talk about a 4th topic, human-centered design. So my experience is, in every one of the companies that I mentioned were the top innovators, they had a focus on human-centered design and had people from the human design-centered schools in their organization. So let's see how well you know human-centered design. So what's the most important part of human-centered design? Understanding unmet customer needs, defining the problem, ideating on multiple solutions, developing prototypes, or testing the solution. I'll give you another 3 or 4 seconds to come up with the answer. Okay, which one is the most important part of human-centered design? So the most important part is defining the problem. So if I go back to IDEO, who essentially I believe is the father of human-centered design, this is their actually design framework, and you see the POV is at the heart of their process, understanding what the problem is. So many innovations fail, not because of a fatal flaw, but because the company doesn't understand what problem they're solving. I love this quote from Einstein. If I had an hour to save the world, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes defining the solution. My experience in working with companies on projects that they've been working on a long time, they really don't understand what problem they're working on. Let me give you an example, Google Glass. Google Glass, great company, but really a failure because Google really didn't understand what problem they were working on. Here's a quote from Forbes. Google didn't improve glass for any specific application. It was a cool tool that didn't have a problem. Actually, I think that there's some great problems that this would have worked on, but Google didn't bother to find the problem and just came out with a cool tool. The 5th area that I want to talk about is lean startup. Once again, what I found is that the successful companies that I've worked with are beginning to use lean startup in their transformational innovation process in some way. So let's see how well you know lean startup for its use in transformational innovations. So why is lean startup valuable? 1, large companies need a learning process. 2, use the business model as a converging tool, or allow teams to rapidly innovate and pivot. Which one do you think? It's number 2. one of the unique things about Lean Startup and its applicability to transformational innovation is that it uses the business model. Now, why is using the business model often the difference between success and failure? Again, many transformational innovations fail, not because of a flaw, but the company doesn't understand the business model that they're looking at. So Segway came up with a pretty neat transportation device, except they said, let's build it for everybody instead of somebody, and they ended up building a huge plant. They didn't look at the business model that they were building. So again, I think they could have been very profitable had they said, let's look at a specific segment and align the channels and costs, etc., so they had a successful business model. So again, another fatal flaw. I love this quote from Steve Blank, who helped found Lean Startup. Sustaining businesses execute a business model, but transformational innovations search for one. I think a key requirement for transformational innovations is to focus again on the business model, not the solution. That was a big takeaway for me when I first learned about transformational innovations. The other part of transformational innovations is that most transformational innovations go through a pivot. So the idea is to have a business model and anticipate pivots. The true product, again, I said this, is the business model, not the solution. Now, let's get back to my question, are you wasting your time at this conference? I would say emphatically no, because I've been doing it for 15 years. What else am I going to say? But we, together with the producers, really tried to focus on having speakers who are evidence-based. And I think that, to us, makes a difference in speakers, bringing speakers who really have evidence-based. I've cited lots of speakers. I will tell you, every one of them has spoken sometimes multiple times at this conference, and we've often gotten them to speak before they have published their book. We also do deep dives in every one of the topics, and in fact, in this year's conference, we do deep dives in 4 of the 6 areas that I mentioned. But my experience, it's not enough to just come to the front-end conference. I think that you need to become a student of innovation. I think today, as opposed to 2003, there's enough knowledge that you need to really embrace it within your company. Now, I teach in an MBA program, so you might think, well, gee whiz, I'll hand out pamphlets for you to come to my MBA course at Stevens. But unfortunately, I don't think getting an MBA is the way to go. Unfortunately, in academia, and hopefully my dean isn't sitting here, is that we do great research, but it's really focused in very narrow areas, and I think oftentimes I question the practicality of it. I believe, and I've seen this in just about every one of these top innovation companies, that they've developed their own in-house training program. I think the time has come for many of your companies to begin to do that, because I continue to be frustrated when I go and visit companies and give talks that many of the number of areas I spoke about today are completely unknown. I'll often say, are you familiar with any of Clay Christensen's work? And many people will look at me blank. In fact, most of my MBA class will look at me blank. And I think the time has come that we need to embrace a lot of these tools and evidence-based innovation management techniques that, in fact, we do know. So, let's conclude. In 2003, we really didn't know about how to be successful, or would have, if we owned or participated in these companies, we would have made the same mistakes. I think in 2017, we understand how to maintain this balance, and it's the balance that will prevent our companies from going under. And you need to learn how to play blackjack. And what I mean by that is, by using evidence methodology, you increase the probability of your success, as opposed to using roulette, which is based on anecdotal methodologies. And finally, you need to become a student of innovation. So we're into our 15th FEI conference, and I'd like to, last point. Part of attending the conference is I believe that it's important for you to take this knowledge and transfer it to obviously other parts in your organization. So I welcome you to the Front End Conference and enjoy.
Years ago, when I just got married, we rented a house and then bought a house, and I was handy and would spend weekends remodeling bathrooms and painting and putting in tile and all this stuff. And we had a party after we'd lived in this house for 4 or 5 years, and one of my friends said, "Dude, what's with the orange shag rug carpet in the middle of your living room?" And sure enough, there was an orange shag rug carpet pole in the middle of our living room, and I was like, "Oh my God, there's this orange pole in the middle of that we couldn't see." It was right there, but we didn't. And as soon as I became aware of this orange pole in the middle of our living room, I had to change it. And so one of the things that struck me about what Peter was saying is that, from 2003 till today, there are all these tools, all these frameworks, all these, practices. And is your company, is your team aware of them? With awareness comes change. And so fundamentally, if your team has these frameworks and knows, how to talk about things, how to move things through a process, they will. But if they don't, change won't happen. So I will encourage you again to parallel engineer. Walk through the conference, go and pull things, use the frameworks that exist. You don't have to invent it on your own. So.